Welcome to this episode of the Think and Inform podcast. My name is Luke Saint. Thank you so much for tuning in. Well, welcome to 2026. Happy New Year, everyone. It's year 2/3 of President Donald Trump. In the first 2 years, it was the big, beautiful bill, and now we're on the other side of the big, beautiful invasion of Venezuela. So that's was serving to really break the internet lately. People are taking sides over Trump's invasion of Venezuela. Head to futureofchristendom.org to check out upcoming events. We have an upcoming event in March. That'll be our Lancastrian Theonomy Symposium. We will be talking about the death penalty. And check out more content. We have debates, we have books, and we have announcements, and we also are planning our October conference, Future of Christendom conference as well. So head to futureofchristendom.org for that. So let's check out, regarding the invasion of Venezuela, let's check out a tweet from C.J. Engel, a Christian nationalist thinker, and see what he has to say about it. I came across this, and I thought what he said was interesting. As in my opinion, it doesn't help his case for Christian nationalism. It kind of argues against it, in my opinion, in a roundabout way. But let's read what he has to say here. He says, this is from C.J. Engel. Accusing Trump of acting without getting the permission from Congress is goofy. Okay, so in his mind, Trump did do something that he ostensibly should have asked Congress for permission, but he didn't. Okay, he continues, Congress is the most morally, culturally, and politically incompetent body in the West. They have abandoned their function within the American system, taken on a rot that would make the Soviets blush and become drunk on the exploitation of the American people. Who cares if they were informed? They are part of the enemy class. Now, I agree with almost every single word here. He's absolutely right. You know, seriously, who cares if those baby-murdering homosexual pedophiles who are getting drunk on the exploitation of America, they're not our friends. They're not here to do good things. They're horrible people, almost down to the man. Appears that there are about 2 or 3 of them that are somewhat decent people, somewhat. So I agree. I agree with him here on the premise. Why should anyone have to go to a morally corrupt body to ask for permission, right? What difference does it make? These people are disgusting people. So why should you go and ask for permission to do this? That's kind of part of my argument, not the whole thing, but part of my argument for why I believe concerning immigration, right? There are people out there who want people who come into this country to ask these same people, right? It's not just, the corruption doesn't end with Congress. You don't think ICE is corrupt? You think they're all, oh no, we're pure. You don't think the police are corrupt? You don't think, Border Patrol is corrupt? They're all corrupt. Every institution is corrupt. Our public schools are corrupt, right? Every institution is corrupt. And here's CJ making a case saying, who cares if you violated the Constitution by not going to these are horrible people, right? You don't need to prove yourself to them. They're disgusting, all right? The immigration officers, they're disgusting. They have disgusting standards. They are disgusting people. And the same point that he's making here regarding Trump doesn't need to prove himself or ask permission from the most corrupt body in Western culture. I'll come right back at you and say, but still you want immigrants to justify themselves to the border agents who are just as disgusting. Our standards for coming in here, they're wicked standards. They're unjust and ungodly standards for coming in. They're arbitrary, which makes them wicked. He's coming at it from this perspective of, people don't need to justify themselves to corrupt civil bodies. and I agree 100%. The immigration office is a corrupt civil body. Their requirements for entry into this nation are not Christian. People don't realize that. I've talked to people about it. They really don't make that connection. They think, I've noticed that with Christian nationalists, their ideal is that people should be Christian if they want to come live here, right? And agree to follow the Christian laws of a Christian nation. That's their ideal. And when push comes to shove, and you ask them, are we a Christian nation with Christian values and requirements for immigrants? Do we have those requirements right now? Well, the answer is no. Well, no, we don't. They don't care if you're a Christian or not if you come into this country. But what for some reason Christian nationalists will do is they'll argue against immigration from their perspective like the ideal is the reality. They'll say we need to kick immigrants out because they're not Christians and they came here illegally. And and when they don't make the connection that when they came here illegally, the requirements were not Christian requirements. They're arbitrary. It's like you not paying all of your taxes, right? Most people don't pay all their taxes. They know it's kind of arbitrary, right? So, the Christian nationalists will get angry at immigrants who aren't Christian, and they'll accuse them of coming over here illegally, and they'll say they need to follow the rules because this should be a Christian nation. But they'll take the ideal and they'll argue against illegal immigration like the ideal is the reality. And I don't know if they have made the connection that immigrants that come over here are not breaking any sort of Christian law at all, but the Christian nationalists act like they do. The Christian nationalists argue against immigration like the immigrants came over here and they were supposed to take a test of Christian faith and they didn't. That's how they approach immigration. It's really weird. I've never really seen anything like it. They take the ideal and they pretend that the ideal is the reality when it comes to when arguing against Christian nation, when they're arguing against immigrants. And most of them have not made the connection for whatever reason. I don't know what the reason is, but most of them have not made the connection that the immigrants, when they come over here legally, they're not skipping a test of faith where they say Jesus is God and I promise to follow these laws. But the Christian nationalists pretend like they do that. It's really weird. It's a bizarre thing, and I don't know why they do it, but I think it's probably one of the reasons they want to make. It's probably the best case that they can probably make for being anti-immigration. So I thought that was an interesting. Post from CJ, because he's not going to say this. Immigration has abandoned its function within the American system, right? It's not a Christian. There's no Christian requirements. Okay, listen loud and clear. Please listen to me. When you come over here as an immigrant, there's no Christian requirements at all. None. Okay? There are no Christian requirements for you to come over here and be an immigrant, to come into this nation legally. None. Okay? So I can say, and I think most Christian nationalists should agree with me here when I say that the immigration system has abandoned its function within the American system. So let me just read this back and kind of apply it in more than one way, okay? So instead of saying, so he says, accusing Trump of acting without getting the permission from Congress is goofy. Okay, let's read it again. Accusing immigrants of acting without getting permission from immigration is goofy. Okay? He says Congress is the most morally, culturally, and politically incompetent body in the West. I'm going to read it again. Immigration is the most, I don't want to say the most, but one of, is a morally, culturally, and politically incompetent body in the West. They have abandoned their function within the American system, taken on a rot that would make the Soviets blush and become drunk on the exploitation of the immigrants. He says American people, but I would say they are exploiting immigrants. He concludes, who cares if they were informed they are part of the enemy class? I agree. Immigration control is part of the enemy class. It's part of the enemy class. Because these same people who are supposed to be vetting are the ones bringing in purposefully people who hate this country. but they're supposed to be vetting them, right? So if you have a job and you're supposed to be keeping out enemies, but you're bringing them in, right? Because it's politicians bringing in these people who brought in all those Haitians, and I'll bet you there's political motivation and political rewards, financial rewards backed by the government for Somalis to come here. I'll bet you that. I'll bet you that much money. That there's a politician approving it somewhere. You can probably look at Tim Walz. That they're inviting these people and they want these people to come in. These people who are supposed to be vetting them, right? So the people who are supposed to be vetting others are the ones not doing it and inviting in people who hate this country, want to destroy it, and build their own mini country within our country of Islamic, wickedness, what have you. So yes, I agree with this tweet, and it applies to more than just one thing. And I want to say this too. When I use the word immigrant, I made this post on Facebook here. I got a lot of comments on it, but most of it had nothing to do with what I said. It was just people beefing. I want to read it for you here. I said, when I use the word immigrant, I'm referring to a person who wants to live in the United States. When I use that term, that's what I mean. There's a lot of good and bad people in there, just like when you use the term American, okay? It's kind of a neutral word. There's good Americans, there's bad Americans. Come on, think. We have Americans who are communists, okay? So when you say, I know for the Christian nationalists listening to this, when you say you should be American to live here, okay? American culture is the best, that kind of a thing. I'm not going to come along and say, oh, so you think, baby murder, blah, 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 because that's part of a culture now, right? That's not what they're talking about, okay? When they use the word American, there's a lot of good and bad people in that term, okay? There's good Americans, there's bad Americans. When I use the word immigrant, a lot of good and bad people come in there, but what I'm referring to is a category of people, just like Americans is a category of people. When Christian nationalists use the word immigrant, they are referring to Muslim jihadis, probably most likely Somalians. So, and I said, this results in a lot of confusions when I say things like, I don't think immigration is wrong. What the Christian nationalists read is you want Muslims here, right? Because immigrant is, for some reason, become, again, the Christian nationalists doing, I think they're being dishonest with their terminology. When you say the word immigrant, they've now taken it to mean Muslim jihadi. That's what they mean when they use immigrants. When they say deport all immigrants, they don't mean the European immigrants. They don't mean even the Mexican immigrants. Some of them don't mean it. Many of them do. Some of them mean brown people. When they use immigrant, it means brown people. But most of them, when they say deport all immigrants, they mean deport all the Muslims. And unfortunately, they're not very honest in their terminology, because immigrant doesn't mean Muslim jihadi. I'm sorry to tell you that, but that's not what it means. Immigrant means somebody who wants to come and live in the United States. In the context, when you use the word contextually in the United States, if I'm talking about British immigrants or immigrants to the UK, I'm talking about an immigrant who wants to go live in the UK, right? When I talk about American immigrants, or in the context of America, immigrants that come here, I'm talking about people who want to live in the United States. All right, that's a broad brush. Good and bad people both contained in that. But Christian nationalists get offended when you say things like that, because to them, immigrant means Muslim jihadi, right? And that's just part of the dishonest terminology that they use. It doesn't mean someone who wants to live in the United States. They have to hijack the term. They have to hijack the term and get militant about it for whatever reason. I'm not sure why they feel the need to hijack the term, but they did, and they have. It no longer means someone who wants to move from one country to another. It means Muslim jihadi who wants to destroy the United States. So there's a lot of confusion involved in it, in the discussion. The Christian nationalists, unfortunately, have muddied the waters big time. Let's go on to Protestant political theory with Dr. Joe Rigney. So this video, I think, is about a year old. Yeah, it's a year old. And it's Dr. Joe Rigney will react to it. We'll respond to it here. An interesting video, well-delivered video. And Dr. Joe Rigney is going to go through what he describes as five different schools of thought within Protestantism regarding the role of the civil magistrate. So let's let him talk here.
And the ideal blueprint. So with those questions in mind, I want to spend the remainder of the time giving a historical overview of a number of different Protestant perspectives. And so I'll begin with what I'm going to call the classic or magisterial two kingdoms perspective. So this will be classic Protestant thought for short. It's roughly the view of the Protestant reformers, including Luther, Calvin, Richard Hooker, Althusius, and Franciscus Junius. Of course, there are variations within those thinkers, but I think there's still a recognizable tradition from those 16th and 17th century theologians. So what did they say? Well, God reveals himself both in nature and in Scripture. These two forms of revelation are complementary and clarifying. While the fall does affect our reasoning abilities, it doesn't obliterate them. Yes, we are totally depraved in the sense that we're dead in sin and blind to the beauty of God. Our sinfulness does pervade every aspect of our existence. However, we are still able to think and reason and are, in principle, able to discern truth from falsehood and good from evil. God has endowed us with a conscience, with a law written on our hearts, and truths about God and our moral duties as humans are evident in creation, even if wicked custom frequently smothers the light of this natural understanding. So when it comes to political philosophy, according to the Reformed, we consult both nature and Scripture, or more properly, natural law, as clarified by the Word. Rightly understood, they speak with one voice. Corporate bodies, whether families, churches, nations, or states, are moral entities and ought to acknowledge the living God by nature and the risen Christ, because all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. And they should seek to obey him in everything. Family, church, and state are distinct institutions with distinct vocations, emphases, and tools, but they ought to assist each other in directing human beings to both their earthly good and their heavenly good. The Old Testament, Israel in the Old Testament is a model for nations today, and we consult Israel's law and history as wisdom for us. We may not be under that covenant, but we can still find it instructive. We distinguish between moral, ceremonial, and civil layers to the law, with the moral law, which corresponds to natural law, still universally binding. The ceremonial law fulfilled and abrogated in Christ, and the civil law useful as divinely sanctioned applications of the moral law to Israel's particular circumstances.
Let me just jump in here real quick and kind of explain what I think is going on when you're dealing with, classical understandings of the role of the civil magistrate. A lot of that is derived from pagan, Roman, and Greek philosophy. It's derived from paganism. I think a lot of people struggle to identify Greco-Roman philosophy as pagan. In their minds, I think it's in some sort of neutral category. And I think they are unwilling to admit with, a clear conscience, this is paganism when I'm reading Aristotle. This is paganism when I'm reading Cicero. I think in their mind, they're like, no, this is Americanism. This is a dissertation about virtue. This is an essay on the good of the population, and they don't put it in its proper category. And remember that foundationally, these are pagans reasoning from pagan worldviews. That means that when they use certain words, it doesn't mean the same word that it means to us as Christians. When they talk about virtue, when they talk about truth, when they talk about justice, when they talk about responsibility, when they talk about commitment, when they talk about the state. These are all from the perspectives of paganism. And I think many Christians, especially Christian nationalists, do not want to admit that foundationally, when they appeal to these people and their understandings of natural law, there's a lot of foundationally pagan ideologies in there. I just don't think they want to admit it, because again, Christian nationalism is about getting rid of paganism and embracing Christianity in the culture. But what they won't do is they won't give up the Roman and the Greco-Roman paganism. They won't do that. They're not going to do that. Much of their thinking is Greco-Roman paganism. It's very ironic, because the arguments they make, and I want to bring it back to this observation. I think this is a true observation. Okay, there's just so much written on it that when you make a statement, there's just a lot of ink on this, so you have to be careful on what you say here. There are two indications from what I've read to denote when someone is now referring to Greco-Roman paganism as foundational to their thinking. There's two indications. One is when you start talking about reason, okay? Now we're talking about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. What they did was they elevated reason as paramount, mankind's reason. Plato, his is I forget what was the essay or the book when he was talking about Socrates was reasoning with somebody. What he ultimately concluded was, how do we find and approach the truth? We can't use our senses because they're corrupt. So anything interpreted through our senses is suspect and it's questionable, right? Because our senses are corrupt. So how can we derive the truth? And his conclusion was we have to reason to it. Reason, man's reason, is the way that we arrive at truth. So there was this exaltation of mankind's reasoning as the mode at which we arrive at truth. So whenever you hear someone, and I'll use Dr. Rigney here, talking about reason, and using this word reason, Greco-Roman paganism has elevated reason to a perverse place in the hierarchy of truth. That's what I believe. So whenever you hear someone start to talk about man's reasoning, okay, we're we have reason and we can see and we can reason and we can make observations. Well, this is all true. I think underneath it all, what's being talked about is not necessarily that we can make observations about the world. That's not what it's limited to. Okay, that's not really what they're referring to. What they are referring to is man's reason above the Word of God in this way. We can reason, we can use man's reason to see which parts of God's law are still applicable, rather than looking at God's law, the judicial law, for example, and saying, okay, this is reasonable. This is a reasonable. I'm going to reason from this. I'm going to reason from the scriptures. All right, God gives me the law. I'm going to reason from that law. What Greco-Roman philosophy, pagan philosophy, has taught people who are classical and classic two kingdoms, and I would even venture to say people like Dr. Rigney, what it teaches is that it's okay to approach the scriptures with your reason in hand and then judge the scriptures through your reason. And you might say, well, that's harsh, or that's not true. That's not what's going on. I'm going to show you here some quotes, okay? This is from Turretin. Has the judicial law been abrogated, okay, by Francis Turretin, all right? And a lot of these guys, these Christian nationalists, they like Turretin, okay? Okay. Three opinions concerning its abrogation. Okay, here's Turretin. There are three opinions about its abrogation, the abrogation of the civil law. The first in defect of the Anabaptists and Antinomians, who think it is absolutely and simply abrogated as to all things, right? The Anabaptists and Antinomians of his day were like, can't use the Old Testament law, all of it's gone, see ya. He says, on this account, whatever reasons are drawn from them, against them from the Old Testament for the right of the magistrate and of war, for the division of inheritance and the like, they are accustomed to resolve with this one answer, that these are judicial and pertain to the Israelite people in the Old Testament, but are now abrogated under the New. The second in excess of those who think that the law is still in force and should be retained, and that Christian states are to be governed like the Jewish, which was the opinion of Karlstadt and Castellio, with whom the Lutheran Brockman agrees. Both wander from the truth. The former because thus many moral things would be abrogated which are contained in the forensic law, right? We can't get rid of the Old Testament law because there's a lot of moral pronouncements there that are still applicable, right? We can't get rid of everything. And then he says this, the latter, and that is the people who think that we should be ruled with the same government that Moses established in the law of God, which is, I'm somebody who believes that. He says the latter are wrong or in error because thus many typical things would have to be observed which are most foreign to the reason of our times. Foreign to the reason of our times, right? And so here you see, again, the influence of, in my opinion, the influence of Greco-Roman pagan philosophy descending even on the likes of Francis Turretin, saying that, you know what's more important than the judicial law is your reason and the reason of your time. And what you need to do is take the reason of your time and look at these laws and say, that's unreasonable. Why? Because just the reason of my time, right? That's the standard. That's the standard of how we judge the scriptures, the reasoning of our time, of how we judge judicial law. I don't know about you, but I think that's a really bad excuse. I think that's a pagan excuse. The Bible never teaches that. That's not from the Bible. And a lot of these ideas you're going to find from, again, even the Reformed Magisterium, they are not from the Bible. They're from Greco-Roman philosophy. There is a lot of appeal to Greco-Roman philosophy. They quote these philosophers as justification for their reasoning. That's not Christian. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's not a Christian thing to do. Now, I don't care. I mean, I think there are times when Paul references sometimes philosophers of his day. He references them sometimes, but he never builds foundationally upon them. You know what I'm saying? Like, for example, he says even, for in him we live and move and have our being, right? That's Paul. I think, if I understand correctly, he's quoting a pagan philosopher or a pagan book. In him we live and move and have our being. Paul's not saying that if it wasn't for that pagan, we wouldn't know that God is the one that in whom we live and move and have our being. He's not making that case. None of Paul's arguments are built upon pagan philosophy or reasoning, right? The idea of the logos, right, and Greek philosophy, okay, is something that John uses when he says, "In the beginning was the logos," right? So, we're in Greek philosophy now, okay? That's not foundational, right? We wouldn't be lost about who Christ is and what his purpose here on earth is if we didn't have Greek philosophy. Do you understand what I'm saying? If John didn't have or was ignorant of Greek philosophy, it's not like he'd be like, I don't know who Christ is and why he's here. I don't know. I'm lost now because I don't have the correct category of thinking regarding, the logos and all that kind of stuff. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's not foundational. Yes, they use it, right? They use it, but it's not foundational. Okay. Unfortunately, many of the reformers, some of them just use, and we'll go into Franciscus Junius here, and his argumentation. a lot of times he'll just say, this guy says this and this guy says that, and I think he's right, or I think he's reasonable. Okay, and that's fine. We do that all the time, right? But when we say he says this and it's true because he said it, and I'm going to build on this, and I'm now going to start contradicting the Bible because of what this guy said, that's paganism, right? We don't contradict the scriptures with pagan philosophy. That's what Christian nationalism does. It contradicts the scriptures with pagan philosophy. Now, I don't think that all pagan philosophy is wrong. I don't think all of it's bad, right? But what we can't do is we cannot take pagan philosophy and start contradicting the scriptures with it, which is what a lot of Christian nationalists do, unfortunately, right? They start to exalt reason and say, well, we can't do that because it's unreasonable. Here's Turretin saying it himself. We can't do biblical law because it's unreasonable. It's foreign to the reason of our times, right? And ultimately, Turretin doesn't really know what he's talking about, because he says the third of the Orthodox who, holding a middle ground, relieve the matter by distinction both according to what has been abrogated and according to what is still in force. He doesn't really answer what is still in force and what has been abrogated because he doesn't really know, right? But again, this is the problem with pagan philosophy. It muddies the waters. When we take a pagan philosophical view and we force it upon the scriptures and start interpreting the scriptures through Greco-Roman pagan philosophy, things become complicated. And that's what Christian nationalism does. It interprets the scriptures through Greco-Roman pagan philosophy, and they want to be Christian in everything, which is completely contradictory. It's unfortunate, but it's true.
The two tables of the law are distinct, but inseparable. Piety, our duties toward God, is the foundation of justice, our duties toward man. The second table rests on the first. The two kingdoms refers to God's twofold government of man. One kingdom is spiritual and heavenly, the other is temporal and earthly. And there are some variations on how this is cast out, but the simplest I've found is to make a biblical distinction between the inner man and the outer man. God governs the inner man directly. There's no human mediation in the spiritual kingdom, in the realm of the conscience. God governs the outer man through various authorities, parents in the family, ministers in the church, and magistrates in the nation. The family, the state, and the visible church are all in the earthly kingdom, whereas the invisible church, which is known only to God, is the spiritual kingdom. This distinction is why Protestants can champion freedom of conscience, freedom in the inner man, the spiritual kingdom, and still permit external compulsion even in religious matters. So no earthly authority is capable of binding your conscience. It can't happen. You can't make people believe. But you can compel or restrict outward behavior, and thus Sabbath laws and laws restricting blasphemy or heresy are, in principle, permissible, maybe even wise.
And this is also, I think, a historic problem with the reformers, because they didn't distinguish between heresy and idolatry. I think that has been I say this humbly because, they were the reformers. But I think there's a lack of, after reading the Westminster on this and looking at their scriptural citations, when they talk about the magistrates allowed to punish blasphemy, the magistrates allowed to punish heresy, right? The magistrates allowed to punish heresy. The problem with that is that they quote passages of Old Testament kings punishing not heresy, but idolatry. All of the references, none of them are punishing heresy. They're all punishing idolatry. God's law doesn't give the magistrate permission to punish heresy, because heresy is, somebody please disagree with me on this, but heresy is a gray area, right? There are people out there who believe that the Baptists are heretics. People believe Arminians are heretics. People believe Calvinists are heretics. People believe Anglicans are heretics. People believe Catholics are heretics. You know what I'm saying? Heresy is not a good standard by which to punish somebody, right? I can see a church body, right, who have articles of faith and say, this is what we believe. And if you're going to commune or with us or if you're going to fellowship with us, we're not going to tolerate a violation of these things which we believe are essential. I can understand that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying I can understand. What I cannot understand is the magistrate punishing this thing. God's law gives the magistrate the responsibility and the right to punish idolatry, but he doesn't give him the right to punish heresy, and there's a difference. Heresy is not always idolatry, and idolatry is not always heresy. Sometimes they're two distinct things. This is the reason that many Baptists were punished. Many Baptists were imprisoned and drowned, etc., because they were called heretics, but they weren't committing heresy. They were committing heresy in the eyes of the church, but was it objective heresy? No, probably not. Right? No, very few people call Baptists heretics these days. Some people still do. And I guess from Joel Webben, I guess he still thinks that Baptists are heretics, and he still calls himself a Baptist. What a weirdo. But this has muddied the waters when we're talking about how the state should interact. When we're talking about how the state should interact with heresy and idolatry, when we give the state the ability to punish or responsibility to punish heresy, that's bad. That's really bad, because then they define heresy. Idolatry is defined in the scriptures. We have a beginning and a middle and an end of idolatry. We know what it looks like, right? Bible puts it in clear terms. When this happens, when you see this person saying these words, or when you see the person doing this action, or when you see a person who is bowing down before this thing, this idol, that's idolatry, okay? We know what idolatry is. We don't know what heresy is, objectively, right? We don't know what it is. I think there are some people who do know what it is and they're right. And I think there's some people who think they know what it is and they're wrong, right? But a lot of the argumentation can't really be brought back to a biblical understanding. A lot of it's traditionalism. And the state can't be punishing people because you violated a tradition. And the state can't be punishing people because you violated dogma. Do you know what I'm saying? The state can't be getting involved because you violated a tradition. The state must only get involved when you violated God's law or violated, basically God. When you violate God's law, you have to be doing something wrong. Violating a tradition is not something that the state should be involved in, and what we cannot be doing is teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And when you start to punish heresy, that's what you're doing. You can't escape the fact that when the state starts punishing heresy, you're now teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Right? Because it comes back to a church body somewhere saying this is heresy, where the Bible does not say this is heresy. Do you understand? Do you understand what I'm saying? So heresy and idolatry are not the same thing. The state should not be punishing heresy.
And so the state may restrict and punish blasphemy, punish offenses against the first table in public, because such things are a threat to social order, and the state has jurisdiction over it. Finally, politics is about the prudential pursuit of justice, applying foundational theological and philosophical principles in a variety of concrete circumstances. There's no single blueprint for all societies.
And that is really the statement I really want to get to in the heart. It's the heart of the discussion for this podcast. There's no single blueprint. And I'm seeing everyone starting to use that term now. There's no single blueprint. There's no single blueprint. There's no single blueprint. This reminds me a lot of the Muslims who make the argument that Jesus isn't God. Why isn't Jesus God? Because he never said, "I'm God, worship me." Okay, we call that special pleading. All right, he has to meet my special requirements, and if he doesn't meet my special requirements, then he fails my own personal test. And when he fails my own personal test, that means he's not who he says he is. What Christian nationalists will do will say, well, the Bible never says it's the blueprint for all nations. Okay, but in the same way that Jesus doesn't say, "I'm God, worship me," that doesn't mean he's not God and we shouldn't worship him. Do you understand what I'm saying? Just because the Bible doesn't say in these terms that this is a blueprint for all nations, okay, does not mean that it's not a blueprint for all nations. Just because it didn't word it the way you wanted it to word. The Bible doesn't word it the way you want it to, okay? Maybe in your mind it's not clear enough, okay? But that's really a problem with you. And it's not really a problem with the scriptures. Okay, I'm seeing this all the time from the Christian nationalists. The Bible's not a blueprint for all nations. Okay, first let's make the observation that's made in a vacuum. The Bible doesn't teach that it's not the blueprint for all nations. Okay, the Bible doesn't teach that. You can't point to any scripture anywhere that says the Bible is not. So if they want the special pleading for, the same standard must be produced against. Okay, the Bible, they say the Bible is not the blueprint for all nations. Okay, and they say it doesn't say it anywhere. Okay, then the same standard you put on others, you must also be willing to answer. Show me where the Bible says it's not the blueprint for all nations. Well, it doesn't say that. Okay, so let's just abandon this argument right now. It's a really bad argument. Show me where in the scriptures, for you who think that the Bible doesn't say it's the blueprint for all nations. Its judicial system is not the blueprint for all nations. Okay, show me where it says this is not the blueprint for all nations. Okay, show me where it says that. We can all agree it doesn't say that. All right, so let's just abandon that special pleading standard. Okay, if you want it for yourself, I'm going to take it for myself as well. But I'm starting to see this pop up all over the place. People are starting to say this is not a blueprint for all nations, blah, 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 blah. And the Christian nationalists really regurgitate that line over and over again. But it's special pleading. So let's go to someone that they like to quote a lot. And regarding Junius here, I'm going to read a passage here from him. We, as Christians, the lens for which you interpret people like Junius, okay? If you abandon the scriptures, you should be afraid of somebody like Junius, right? But if you don't abandon the scriptures, you shouldn't be afraid of somebody like Junius, right? Very few people have heard of him. He was kind of a minor presence. From what I understand, he was a minor presence in the Reformation, as far as his influence on like the five solas and things like that on today. His main influence was on the Reformed Magisterium, which this country kind of rejected. This nation kind of rejected the Reformed Magisterium. So his influence is minor in regard to the American tradition regarding the civil magistrate. But he's starting to be resurrected by the Christian nationalists because he's playing their tune and they like it. So let me just we shouldn't be afraid to read these guys. And okay, what are they saying, and how do they get to these conclusions? Who are they quoting? What's their reasoning? Things like that. So he says here, this is from the Mosaic Polity, and this is a book that he wrote, a treatise about how the Mosaic Law applies to our day and age. So we're in the preface here, and he says this: concerning its application, the judicial law. Indeed, what shall we say to that which we daily turn our mind and thoughts so many times that divine wisdom excites one's own affections for incredible things? For he, God, adapted each and every one of these laws, his own laws, to the race of the Jews gathered from the number of the rest of the most degenerate human beings, as human beings were in the nature of things. Okay? I'm going to read that again. For he adapted each and every one of these, his own laws, to the race of the Jews gathered from the number of the rest of the most degenerate human beings, as human beings were in the nature of things. He's saying that there are many different applications of the moral law, right? And the judicial law was just one example, among many, of how to apply God's moral law to a society. So what he's saying is, God's judicial law is not for all time and all people. God's judicial law is one adaptation of God's moral law to a people. Now, he just says this in a vacuum. Okay? The Bible doesn't teach this. Like, please, just hear me when I say this. The Bible does not teach this. When you read Psalm 119, okay, that's not what it teaches. 1 Timothy 1, 8-11, it does not teach that. Again, for people, for the billionth time, I got to read this again. For we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully. Understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and the disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God, which I have been just entrusted. He's not making a case that the judicial laws of God here were just one example among many. He's saying, no, regarding these crimes, these are all crimes, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, enslavers, liars, perjurers, sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, murderers. These are crimes, okay? These are not violations of the moral law. These are violations of the judicial law, okay? These are judicial crimes. We're talking about explicitly the civil law, not the ceremonial. We're not talking about the moral. This is the civil law. And he says it is good if one uses it lawfully. Understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and the disobedient. The law is not, he's saying here, the law is not laid down just for the Jews. The law is laid down for any society that has the lawless and the disobedient, the ungodly and the sinners. This is the exact opposite case that Junius is making. Junius is saying the law was laid down for just the Jews in that time and that place. Paul is saying, no, the law was laid down for anyone who comes into contact with the lawless and the disobedient, the ungodly, the sinners, murderers, sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, etc. He brings the civil law right into the New Testament time and place. Okay, you have Junius saying in a vacuum, okay, it's arbitrary. He's just saying God adapted it. There's nothing in the Bible that teaches that. I'm going to say it again. Please listen to me. Nothing in the scriptures teach that God adapted his moral law for the Jews. Nothing says that. There's not a verse anywhere that says, oh, God could have done it differently, but he just kind of chose this way arbitrarily. No. There's not a single Bible verse that teaches that. So when Junius is making this case, he adapted each and every one of these, his own laws, to the race of the Jews. That's not what the Bible teaches. And our radars should immediately be going up, going, there is something wrong here. There's something wrong. Okay? I get what you're saying, Junius. I get it. I understand. All right? I'm hearing you. I can steel man your position. Okay? But that's not what the Bible teaches. You cannot reverse engineer what he said from the scriptures. They don't teach it. Okay? And unfortunately for Christian nationalists, since they love pagan philosophy, Roman and Greco-Roman pagan philosophy so much, they don't hold Junius to the scriptures. They're like, oh, he's reformed and he's talking about the magisterium. That's all I need. And they just quote him And that's the end of it. It's true because Junius says so, right? Not to say that all of them do that. Obviously, many of them, I believe, criticize him. But if you adopt Greco-Roman philosophy as foundational to your worldview, and you start to interpret everything through I only listed one earlier, but there's two things. One is the reasoning of mankind. When you start to put a lot of emphasis on mankind's reason, that's Greco-Roman philosophy. And the other one is for the good of society, for the good of the people, or just the good in general, the good, whatever that means. That's also Greco-Roman. When you're talking about, when you hear someone referencing, we're going for the magistrate's here for the good, right? Now the scriptures say he is a servant for your good, okay? But that's not talking about what the pagan philosophers meant for the good of society, for the good, this ethereal concept of the good. Paul is not talking about that, right? He's talking about he's a servant for your good, that his role is good, that his function is good, his existence is good, right? And here's what it is, and he defines it very clearly what he should be doing, okay? But unfortunately, pagan Greco-Roman philosophers leave the good as very undefined, right? Few of them define what the good is. It's just the good, right? Whatever it is, but it's a placeholder for basically whatever it is you want. And the good for Greco-Roman philosophy, from what I've read, is not something that's really definable. It's just a placeholder concept for whoever adopts this philosophy to insert his own worldview into which he can install his worldview. So Junius continues here. Indeed, he most providentially accommodated all things to their own mode, to persons, things, and circumstances, by which it was a body of the children of God in his very own house of living stones, united through grace, when by innumerable signs and proofs, some transient, some permanent, a confirmation given in every age, one, concerning the covenant promises and the truth, trustworthiness, and the constancy of that divine grace, which what would not wither away by any of the viciousness of human beings, and two, concerning the law. Okay, big word salad there. Okay, big word salad. Unfortunately, these reformers are notorious for that. And anyone who's who loves pagan or is influenced by Greco-Roman philosophy and Latin and things like that, there's a lot of word salads. And, these people from 400 or 500, 600 years ago, they're difficult to read. And you think about, like, when you read, like, Cromwell, he's not difficult to read like this. When you read Cromwell and you read what he said, you're like, okay, I get it. I understand what you're saying. But someone like Junius is much more difficult to understand. A lot of word salads. So he begins here. Indeed, he most providentially accommodated all things in their own mode to persons, things, and circumstances. That's not true. Okay? That's not true. That's not what the Bible teaches. All right? He didn't adapt it to their own mode and circumstances. In fact, you can make the opposite case. He made them adapt. Right? He brought them out and said, you've got to follow these laws and these rules. I'm not adapting them to your own circumstances. All right? You've got to adapt your circumstances to me. If you understand the sacrificial system, you really had to adapt to it, right? If the foreigner wanted to be circumcised, he then had to adapt to that system, which was not a simple thing to do. It's very complicated, and you have to be careful. Which is why the Pharisees began making all these extra laws and making a hedge around a hedge around a hedge around a hedge of the law, and suddenly you're not following the law anymore. You're just following the tradition. But you can understand why. Once you begin to see how important it was to keep yourself clean by ceremonial standards, and how much harm you could bring to your nation, to your neighbor, to your family if you did not follow these laws. So the adaptation did not come from God adapting his law to them. The adaptation came from them adapting themselves to God's law. That's what they had to do. And the problem today is still that we want to adapt ourselves to God's law. We want God's law to be adapted to our circumstances, our situation. We want God's law, and that's one of the appeals of general equity theonomy, is you can adapt God's law to your situation, right? And here you see basically this idea that contributes to general equity theonomy is that, there's many ways to do God's law, many ways, If as I said before, if God says, 2 or 3 witnesses, every case shall be established, maybe you don't want that for your society. Maybe you want 20 witnesses, and until the judge has 20 witnesses, you can just, disregard, right? You can adapt it, right? That's a civil law. You don't necessarily have to follow it. Since it's civil law, it's a principle that you may or may not follow, right? You have to adapt it to the reason of your age, right? And when God says, the hands of the witnesses shall be first against them, that's a civil law. You don't necessarily have to follow it. You can have a professional executioner who's got no skin in the game, who's just killing people because that's his job, right? And he doesn't care whether you're innocent or guilty. I get paid to kill people. That's what I'm here for. Pass the buck, that kind of a thing. So, if God says that, there's a death sentence for those who strike their fathers and mothers, maybe you give them a prison sentence of 80 years. Maybe you take their life away and force the population to pay for 3 hots and a cot, right? So, God's judicial law, you don't really have to follow it, right? Because what I've quoted you is none of them are moral. All of them are civil, given the context of the civil operation of the Mosaic polity. So you don't have to really follow those, right? That's what they're saying here, right? God adapted it. So you can, in the same way that God adapted his moral law, you can adapt your moral law too. That's the arguments being presented here. He continues, Junius, thus the moral precepts taught most absolutely the most absolute truth of morals, aiming at the proper duties toward God and human beings. So also the ceremonial precepts taught the most absolute truth for the faith of those striving for God through human beings from this depraved world. So also the judicial precepts taught the most absolute truth of order pertaining to cultivating morals and faith in this republic which God instituted. Again, this last phrase, this sentence here. So also the judicial precepts taught the most absolute truth of order. Okay? Order. This idea of order, again, the emphasis on the good, on order and reason comes not from Scripture, the emphasis. It comes from Greco-Roman pagan philosophy. So when we start to talk about order in society, the good of society, and the reasoning of mankind, and his ability to bring these out through reason, not God's law, reason. How do we get order and how do we get the good? Mankind's reason. That's pagan Greco-Roman philosophy, and the Christian nationalists are just eating it up. So that's all we'll say from well, actually, we'll continue here for a little bit.
So questions of political regime, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, or some mixture are matters of wisdom. Christian statesmen must take into account the character and history of the people, who they are, where they've been, the geography, the size, the circumstances on the ground, as it were, as they seek to wisely govern.
And my question for people who hold to that view would be, okay, what's unreasonable about the Mosaic polity for today? Tell me something that's unreasonable about it. So, okay, if I could just rewind that here real quick.
Take into account the character and history of the people, who they are, where they've been, the geography, the size, the circumstances on the ground, as it were, as they seek to wisely govern. In this sense, the Westminster Confession of 1646, it's the British version, and of 1789, the American version, the Belgian Confession, the 39 Articles of the Church of England.
Yeah, so you have to start off with this idea, okay? that I question where is this idea from? Where does this idea come from? Okay, that the Mosaic polity is unreasonable. Okay, my first question is, who told you that? How is this unreasonable? By what standard are you looking at the Mosaic polity, the way they ran their government, and saying this is unreasonable for today? Why? Who can authoritatively say that the Mosaic polity is unreasonable? And what doesn't make sense to me is these governments that he listed.
So questions of political regime, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, or some mixture.
Why doesn't he say theocracy? Why is it that these other man-made systems are reasonable, but God's system is not reasonable? Why? Can you give me a reason why you would approach God's system, see how they accomplished politics, how they accomplished justice, and say, that's unreasonable? What would your argument be? This is unreasonable because why? This is the emphasis, right? Is it not? Of Christian nationalism is reason. Okay, so what's your reason? Use reason to tell me that God was unreasonable. God's system is unreasonable for today. Give me a good reason. I don't think they have one. I don't think there's a good reason. I think the best argument they have is, well, you could do it if you want. I think that's their best argument. But I think they have to appeal to Greco-Roman philosophy to say it's unreasonable. Why? Because God's law doesn't emphasize the good, order, and reason the way they wanted to emphasize it. Which is why you got Stephen Wolfe arguing for Christian dictator, and at the same time trying to recover the American tradition, doesn't see the irony. But what is the reason that you would look at the way? And honestly, I think the real reason is because most of them don't know how God's law and God's system worked. They're ignorant of it. I recently got into a discussion online, and I accused my acquaintance. I said, you don't know God's law. We kept talking, and then later he asked me about slavery, and then I said, the slave's free to leave at any time, right? It's not the way that we understand slavery today. God's system of slavery is much different than, because we basically interpret God's system through the 1860s, right? We look at the 1860s, we learn about slavery from that, and then we take that and we force it onto the biblical text and say, oh, it's the same thing, right? And we interpret God's system of slavery through antebellum South. That's just what we do, right? Now, there's no reason to do that, but that's what we do. And when he came to me and he said, okay, wait a sec, is there a verse that says the slave is free to leave at any time? I said, yes, Deuteronomy 23:15. I don't know if he even knew about that verse, but he had to ask me that question. And then he started to look into it, and I think I was the first person in his life to introduce him to that text. I'm sure he's read it. But unfortunately, since we don't know God's law, we don't know God's system, verses like Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16 have no place to land in our heads, because we think to ourselves, there's no way that you were not allowed to return a fleeing slave, right? Because that's what Deuteronomy 23:15, 16 says. You're not allowed to return a fleeing Ebed. It doesn't say foreign. It doesn't say Jewish or Hebrew. It just says Ebed, any slave. That includes foreign and domestic. You're not allowed to, the magistrate is not allowed to force them to go back to the master from whom they ran. And since we interpret God's law through the lens of antebellum South, there's no place for that verse or that law to land in our head for it to make sense, because we think to ourselves, there's just no way that this is actually saying what it's saying. So the verse is flying around looking for a place to land in our heads, ends up not landing anywhere and is forgotten, and we move on. And we don't even remember that we read that verse. Why? Because we're not being taught God's law. Christians are ignorant of God's law. And since we're ignorant of God's law, we don't know how to love God. We don't know how to love our neighbor. This results in a lot of the confusion that we're experiencing as far as trying to wrangle this government to make it do our bidding. But Christians are they're just ignorant of God's law. They don't know how it works. They don't know who the officers are. They don't know the precepts. They don't know the jurisprudence. They don't get it because they're ignorant of it. And so to them, it looks unreasonable.
Are matters of wisdom. Christian statesmen must take into account the character and history of the people, who they are, where they've been, the geography, the size, the circumstances on the ground, as it were, as they seek to wisely govern. In this sense, the Westminster Confession of 1646, it's the British version, and of 1789, the American version, the Belgian
I just want to know how are we drawing these conclusions? Can I not say to you right now, show me a verse where it says that the church that Paul sets up with elders and stuff like that is the model for us today? Why can't we just reduce the New Testament to principles and be like, just do church however you want? If you want to do elders, do it. If you don't want to do elders, then don't do it. Does anybody say that? Where does the Bible say that the church is the blueprint for all peoples and all times? I want that phraseology. Give me that phraseology in the New Testament that the system of church government that Paul argues up and mandates and sets up is the blueprint for all times and all people. Were these letters not directed to Asia Minor 2,000 years ago? So it's not for us in our time and our place, right? The immediate context is to them. Where does it become to us? Don't use the confessions. Just use the scriptures. Where does the Bible say that the church government that Paul sets up is for all times and all places, the blueprint for everything? Yet we all act like it is. Where does the Bible say that God's blueprint for the family is the blueprint for everybody? Right? There are many laws in the Bible that talk about the family that are not the Ten Commandments. Okay? They're not the Ten Commandments. And it gives rules and responsibilities to fathers and mothers. Are we free to disregard them and say, yes, it's an adaptation? That's just an adaptation. I can adapt it differently. That's how cults get started. My goodness. But where in the Bible does it say that the church is the blueprint for our day and our age? Where? I want that phraseology. Don't take a verse and say, here's where it says, I want the blueprint verse. Give me the blueprint verse.
Confession, the 39 Articles of the Church of England all operate from shared Protestant political principles. So Britain, Holland, and America, from the 17th through the 19th centuries, were all different applications of common political principles. So that's our baseline. And to put my cards on the table, it basically describes my own political philosophy. Other contemporary proponents include Stephen Wolfe, Timon Klein, and Brad Littlejohn. So let's turn to our first variation, Kuyperian Neo-Calvinism. Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch theologian and statesman of the late 19th and early 20th century. His legacy continues in the Dutch Reformed tradition. Bavinck and Duyveert, or however you say his tradition, was this, quote, "The state shall allow no less, but also no more, freedom for the development of the Christian religion." Yeah, Gary Bonson. And Gary North, David's his son. Like the Kuyperians, the Reconstruction...
So I wanted to skip to the part where he's talking about theonomy and Reconstruction.
Reconstruction has sought to finish the Reformation. So
I wonder about that. I've not come across that. I don't know anyone who says we're trying to finish the Reformation from Greek constructionism. Maybe there's somebody out there who used that terminology. From what I understand, it was people, I mean, the Reconstructionists were semper reformanda people, right? They're not like, okay, we've finished. We finished the work of the Reformation. No more work needs to continue. I've never heard any Christian say that. I've never seen a writer say that We need to finish the work of the Reformation. People who believe in the work of the Reformation know that there's a separa reformanda aspect to it. It's even, dare I say, even part of the American tradition. Jefferson even believed in it, that you've got to keep on reforming. That things devolve, they erode. There's entropy here, and you need to constantly maintain and reform. Right? This is the Think and Reform podcast. Right? We're always reforming, because we have a perfect standard. By the standard of God's word, we're never going to achieve perfection, which means that we can continue to get closer and closer to it. Since we're never going to be perfect, that means that we have to continue going in the direction of holiness, even though we're never going to achieve holiness. But that indicates that since we're never going to get there, we should keep on going there. There's always going to be something that we lack that's going to need reformation. I've never heard anyone say, oh yeah, we need to complete or finish the Reformation. Most people are like, we need to continue the Reformation.
So building on the epistemology of Cornelius Van Til, the Recons were highly suspicious of dualisms, especially the dualism of nature and grace, and regarded the presence of that kind of dualism among the Reformers as a holdover from medieval Catholicism. Okay, classic Protestantism, they said, had not sufficiently detoxed from Aquinas and Aristotle.
Which I agree. I agree with that.
This was especially true in relation to natural revelation. The Recons certainly acknowledged the existence of this general natural revelation, but following Van Til, they regarded it as effectively useless apart from Scripture. Why? Man's radical depravity. Because of man's truth-suppressing rebellion,
man's radical depravity, but I mean, I think a better terminology would be total depravity. Man's total depravity. I suspect he didn't use that term, total depravity, because that's the usual phraseology. I don't really hear people saying radical depravity, but the usual phraseology is total depravity. I suspect that he didn't want to use total depravity because that means that we'd be connected to Calvin, and I think everyone kind of wants to gatekeep Calvin for their side. I suspect. I don't know though.
There's no use consulting natural revelation or natural law. Instead, we ought to simply go to the Bible. We should consult the Scriptures. And when they did, they found that the classic Reformed approach to the law of Moses, was suspect. It didn't seem to track in their minds with the biblical text itself. So according to Rushdoony, it is a serious error to say that the civil law was abolished, but the moral law retained. At most points, they cannot be distinguished. So that tripartite division, that doesn't really work. Their basic posture toward the Old Testament was this. The Old Testament continued in force, except in those places where the New Testament explicitly abrogated it. So this is kind of the opposite of Kuyper. Whereas Kuyper said, I don't see it in my New Testament, and so if it's not reiterated in the New Testament, we don't do it. And the New Testament doesn't have any punishments for blasphemy in the state. So we don't go to the Old Testament for look. The Recons did the opposite. If the New Testament doesn't abrogate it or tell you stop doing it, it continues straight across. You keep looking to Moses. Here's Bonson. Our attitude must be that all Old Testament laws are presently our obligation. All of them are our obligation, unless further revelation from the lawgiver shows that some change has been made. We must assume continuity with the Old Testament rather than discontinuity. So, for example, the ceremonies and sacrificial system are no longer in force. Why? Because the New Testament tells us so. But the Old Testament civil laws, including its punishments, continue to be relevant and binding as God's ideal way of governing societies.
Now, it's not just the Recons who believed that. What did he just say? They continue to be binding. Let me just skip down here. Let me just read you something from Gillespie here. Uh-oh. I'm breaking stuff. Uh-oh. Let me just go here. I'm on my friend's profile. Let me go down. Just read an excerpt from Gillespie here. Talking about his idea of general equity. down here and find it. Kind of decide it here. Okay. What Gillespie meant by general equity. But things immutable, is a quote from Gillespie, but things immutable and common to all nations are the laws concerning moral trespasses, sins against the moral law, as murder, adultery, theft, enticing away from God, blasphemy, striking of parents. Now that kind of smacks of 1 Timothy 1, 8 to 11. Now that the Christian magistrate is bound to observe these judicial laws of Moses, which appoint the punishments of sins against the moral law. Okay, there's Gillespie, right? A Westminster divine, saying that the Christian magistrate is bound to observe these judicial laws of Moses, which appoint the punishments of sins against the moral law. So he is bringing in the punishments. It's not just the Reconstructionists saying this. This is Gillespie from his own mouth saying he's bound to observe these judicial laws of Moses, which appoint the punishments, not only the laws, the moral laws, but the civil punishments are the civil magistrate is bound by these. Now, the problem with quoting with somebody like Gillespie is a lot of these guys, a lot of these Westminsters, Puritans, and Protestants, Covenanters, things like that, they wrote a lot of stuff. And unfortunately, you can find them many places where it looks like they're arguing for concept, and then years later they write a book and it looks like they're arguing against it. So I'm sure someone could find Gillespie saying the opposite of what he just said, right? Which is why we cannot go to people and philosophy and philosophers to establish justice and find out the responsibility of the magistrate in the land, because they write so much they end up contradicting themselves.
In fact, according to the recons, this is why God gave us the Old Testament law. It shows us the ideal way that society should be ordered. Now, many of the theonomists appreciated that Kuyperian emphasis on cultural transformation, and even that idea of distinct and sovereign spheres. The theonomists had a strong libertarian streak that insisted on a small and limited government that did not encroach on the authority of the church or the family. However, they rejected any kind of neutrality when it comes to the state. And because they emphasized Scripture over natural revelation, they sought to ground all institutions in the lordship of Christ, not just this generic natural knowledge of God. So the state should acknowledge Christ and govern accordingly. And that includes instituting punishments for blasphemy and heresy along the lines of the Mosaic Law. What's more, because they tended to be post-mill, they saw the establishment of Christ's lordship in every sphere, including the state, as a fulfillment of the Great Commission and the duty of every Christian. So to summarize this...
I'm just getting excited listening to him. It's a very faithful representation there. Generally speaking, is very faithful. I'm just like, oh man, this is great stuff.
Point. Both the Dutch Kuyperians and the American theonomists broke from classic Protestant political thought, but in different ways. The Kuyperians used...
I'm sorry, like I said before, there's so many Protestants and classic Protestant writers. You can find one agreeing with your position in almost anything because they wrote so much. You can find them saying something that kind of eludes or looks like they're agreeing with your position. And I just don't think that classic Protestant thought is as unified as people think it is. Because, like I said, I just showed you a quote from Gillespie, who was a classic Protestant thinker, one of the big wigs in the Westminster Confession. Let me just make sure. I want to make sure I'm remembering it right. I want to make sure that I'm being faithful here and I'm not getting my reformers confused. Okay, we're back to purely Presbyterian. And we have, it is George Gillespie. Okay, writing this. Okay, I'm making sure here that I'm being faithful. Yeah. So he was one of the bigwigs of his. He had a hand in drafting the Westminster Confession of Faith. So he is one of the big influences there. All right, and here he is, absolutely arguing for the application of judicial punishments. Right, and I just the body of writing from that time from these men. And I mean, just take John Owen, for example. He's just really difficult at times to read and understand his concepts. He's so wordy, and these run-on sentences. I don't think any one person can really harness this body and accurately summarize it. And I think the only people to do that were the people who wrote down the five solas. I think the five solas are the only thing that you can say is the common theme of these reformers is the five solas. I think and I think there's a reason we have the five solas, because that was the common message that you can find. Okay, this is repeated over and over again. I don't think the magisterium and the role of the magistrate is something that you can find a consistent consensus. Maybe people can, but I just, from what I read and when I'm looking back at the sources, I'm just kind of shaking my head every time. And I'm using Rigney here as an example, that he's kind of like limiting this idea of the role of the civil magistrate and the punishments of the Old Testament to the Reconstructionists, when I just read for you, George Gillespie saying, no, 400 years ago, the magistrate should punish the way that the Old Testament punishes. And someone might come along and say, well, you're not understanding it correctly. Okay, maybe I'm not understanding what he's saying correctly, but you can't deny that there's confusion here. There's confusion. And I think the only time they weren't confused was the five solas. I'm just throwing that out there. Maybe you can find and you can prove, a more consistent. There's other themes out there that are as consistent as the five solas. But I think the only safe ground you can stand on, with respect to the reformers, what was the consistent message of the reformers? I don't think the magisterium was consistent. I don't. These guys fought with each other. They argue with each other all the time, and a lot of times their concepts of 400 years ago are just different from the concepts we have now. And I think the only safe ground you can say, here's the running themes, here's the consistent theme of the Reformation was the five solas. And outside of that, I think there's a struggle. I just do, from what I've read from the claims of these people.
Sphere sovereignty and a sharp distinction between natural knowledge and revealed knowledge of God to essentially create an almost neutral secular public square, a state founded on a generic theism, but they still insisted on Christian transformation in every other area of life. The theonomists, on the other hand, rejected all of these dualisms, like nature and grace, and with a more radical view of man's sinfulness, sought to build every aspect.
And he's using that term radical. You mean total depravity. The Reconstructionists are consistent Calvinists. We believe in the total depravity of mankind. I don't think he wants to use that term, because I think it connects it to Calvin.
Of society on the scriptures, rejecting that classic Protestant distinction when it comes to the law, the abiding and asserting the abiding validity of the civil code. But again, let me just stress this: both were self-conscious departures from classic Protestant thought.
Like I said, I just, man, I mean, the Reconstructionists absolutely they love the Puritans. They love the separatists. They love 1600s America. I mean, I wonder I wonder just in my mind how he could authoritatively say that the Reconstructionists were going away from the consistent Protestant message, the consistent classic Protestant message. And I think if you read their work, they're quoting the Reformers all the time in favor of their argumentation. I don't think that they thought or even said, yes, we are definitely going away from the Reformers. Maybe some of them said that, but I think they quote the Reformers all the time. So I just wonder.
They both sought to finish the Reformation by bringing Protestant political thought in line with their understanding of Protestant theological principles.
Yeah, okay, so maybe that's his synthesis there. Okay, so the Reconstructionists were trying to take what they thought the Protestants were saying and align it to a more consistent, they were trying to make the Reformers consistent. So, okay, I understand what he's saying there. Now
that brings us to our third variation, our fourth group, third variation.
Okay, so he just goes on to the fourth one there. So wrapping this up here, for a lot of Christian nationalists, what he just said was a big no-no, that they're departures from classic Protestantism. And I think a lot of Christian nationalists think that they are in the Reformed club, and anyone who's outside the Reformed club is wrong about basically anything that they say, right? And so when you're threatened with becoming outside, your thinking is outside of classical Protestant thinking, that's like a boogeyman to the Christian nationalists. Oh no, I'm outside of the traditions, right? Oh no, I'm not in the tradition anymore. They're afraid of that. They don't want to be outside the tradition, right? They're in the tradition club, right? So there's this fear. There's a fear inside Christian nationalism to be outside their tradition. To be outside the scriptures, not really a big deal, but to be outside tradition is kind of a bigger boogeyman. I think Rigney kind of hinted at that when he said these guys are departing from classical Protestant thinking, and that scares Christian nationalists. I don't want to be outside the classical Protestant thinking, right? And I think what Wolf's book really contributed to that. He kind of developed this fear. The foundation for all of our thinking and reasoning is not really the scriptures, it's the Reformers. Even the Reformers who carried residual Catholic thinking, which he says at the introduction of his book, that's okay, right? Why? Because they're the Reformers. I just assume that they're right about everything. That's the beginning of his book. I'm not making it up. So this, for someone whose thinking and reasoning comes from the scriptures, to be threatened with you're outside of the classical Protestant thinking on this is not as big of a threat as it is to a Christian nationalist who is trying to be in the Reform Club at all times, right? I don't want to be outside the traditions, right? It's all about the traditions. My father's traditions, men who are older and wiser than me, the Reformers, I'm Reformed, so I got to be Reformed in everything. They were right about everything. That's how they act, really. They won't say that, but that's how they act. So he didn't conclude that, that presentation of here's why they're wrong. He said enough to scare, I don't know, but to kind of, scare is too strong a word there, to kind of warn, if you will, his listeners that this is outside what he thinks is the classical Protestant tradition. And that was enough to say, to hint that that's why it's wrong. Not because it's not biblical, but because it's out of the classical Protestant thinking. I think that was good enough for him and in that camp to be like, that's why they're wrong, right? Don't need to really explain anything further than that about why they're wrong. Just know that it's outside of classical Protestant thinking, therefore it's wrong. That's kind of the implication there. So I just want to say thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Think and Reform podcast. Have a happy new year, and head to futureofchristendom.org. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, my friends, think and reform.